Our third presenter is Elyse Remenapp. Elyse grew up in a very small suburb on the east side of Detroit, and after changing her not yet declared major 4 times during her 1-year stay at Wayne State University, she came across the Cultural Studies program and transferred her second year. Cultural Studies, completely different from what she had expected, turned out to be a great fit for her desire to question and understand the world in complex, contextual, and historical ways. While at Columbia, she has also completed a minor in public relations. Her academic and research interests are at the intersections of Marxism, feminism, and public health issues. In her spare time, Elyse works most days at a local juice bar and is graduating, as she says, feeling very accomplished and open to a myriad of future possibilities. And to use the language of Brandon, future utopias. The title of her presentation is Ruin Pornography and Urban Representation in Photography: The Aesthetics and Politics of Appropriation in the Ruins of Detroit. In this project, Elyse Remenapp examines the politics of representation in the ruins of Detroit, a book of photography by Yves Marchand and Romaine Meffre, in order to understand Detroit as a privileged site of ruins photography, critically also referred to as ruin pornography. Examining the book as a representation of Detroit's decay, argues Remenapp reveals an implicit power dynamic which neglects Detroit's complex history and the lived experience of its residents. Paying particular attention to the dialectic of race and labor and their capitalism, she traces the modern urban history of Detroit in order to contextualize and reframe the state of ruin presented in the photographs. The project argues that Marchand and Meffre's work appropriates Detroit's state of crisis and decay for aesthetic consumption through a process of exploitation of Detroit ruin as a space, while simultaneously, if not by also, erasing Detroit's actual residents from this spatial representation altogether. Elyse Remenapp.
So I arrived at this project because originally I was thinking about homes, and then particularly about the juxtaposition of having homelessness and abandoned homes within the same geographic space. So I was thinking about Detroit because I grew up there, and it's the city that I know the best and care the most about, and it is in such a uniquely difficult situation. Since moving to Chicago especially, it's become increasingly clear to me that the idea of Detroit that most people have is not the same one that I have, and that most of the representations that form these perceptions of Detroit as this devastated, apocalyptic, Wild West type space do not come from Detroit people. So thinking about abandoned homes turned into thinking about abandoned spaces more generally. And this book, The Ruins of Detroit, became sort of the perfect manifestation of this problem. The Ruins of Detroit is a photo book published in 2010, the result of a 5-year collaboration between Yves Marchand and Romaine Meffre. The book features hundreds of photographs of Detroit's abandoned structures and urban decay. To give you an idea of what that looks like, here are the 5 photos I've focused on in my paper. This photo appears without a title or caption between the title page and the foreword. No context is given as to where this is or what exactly this is, but it sets the tone for the rest of the book. You are here. This image serves an introductory function, not just as the first photo in the book, but also as an introduction to a particular way of seeing Detroit as an image that is damaged and decaying. This is a perspective that the photographers carry throughout. This is Packard Motors plant. This photo is one of many which depict Detroit's vast industrial ruin. I emphasize the factory as a space of significance in Detroit's history, both as a site of production and as a site that carries meaning on the interactions of race and labor. The exploitation and history of oppression is missing from the way the factory is represented in this collection. This is Ballroom, American Hotel. For me, this image represents the decadence and wealth experienced by some Detroit residents, and especially in the 1920s. This is MW Mount Sinai Grand Lodge, Brush Park. While this house is crumbling, you can see new construction in the back. It's in the neighborhood of Brush Park, which is a gentrifying neighborhood. It's a regular occurrence in Detroit for ruined structures to share space with new or otherwise functioning buildings. Now, this photo is one of the most significant in the scope of my project. It's called Rich Decks Apartments. This photo stands in contrast with the rest, portraying life for just one moment in the middle of hundreds of bleak, lifeless scenes. The Rich Decks Apartments are not themselves remarkable, but this is the only photo in the entire series in which you can see human beings. If it weren't for these two people, a viewer may think that there's nobody left living in Detroit. The 1920s were a time of massive wealth and growth in population, as well as space for Detroit. Between 1910 and 1930, Detroit's population tripled. The car became Detroit's dominant industry. Images and texts on Detroit's ruin often gesture back to this heyday period, where the population was at its highest. There was an influx in industrial and manufacturing jobs. Coincidentally, there was perceived to be a general increase in the quality of urban life. Much of Detroit's success and wealth was attributed to the fact that auto industry workers were relatively higher paid, at least enough so that they could afford a house and to buy the products that they made. A closer look at these industrial jobs gives the project a more nuanced view of what is seen as a thriving Detroit. While many Detroiters' quality of life increased during this time, working class and immigrant Detroiters faced overcrowding and disease. Racialized hatred in America was not limited to the Deep South. Detroit was and still is heavily segregated. Thomas Shagrew writes that, quote, in the 1920s, white Detroiters began to define their communities in terms of racial homogeneity and to make apparent to blacks the high cost of penetrating those communities, end quote. The photographers romanticize this period, stating, quote, these were times of lounging about and spending, big parades, excess and carefree life, the roaring 20s. People enjoyed themselves in bars and tea rooms, attended variety shows, and went to the movies for only a few cents, end quote. It is important for this project to challenge any nostalgia for this time if it forgets or ignores the inequalities fundamental to the prosperity experienced by some. To situate photos of the ruins of Detroit as they have appeared in the last decade, next to an idealized version of Detroit in the 1920s, does nothing to help the viewer understand how the city of Detroit came to look the way these photographs are presenting it. The situation in Detroit today is generally characterized as a crisis due to the overwhelming poverty, unemployment, crime, and decay that plague the city and its decreasing population. Thomas Shagrew describes a particular specificity to the type of post-industrial urban poverty in which poor people are extremely segregated and isolated from the labor market in ways that were not true about poverty prior to industrialization. Attempting to understand the forces that led Detroit to the state of ruin these photographs claim to have captured is crucial to a radical contextualization of the photos. The ruins of Detroit belongs to the specific genre of imagery depicting urban decay that has gained popularity and recognition called ruins photography. Detroit, due to its unique state and situation, has become a privileged site, drawing new attention from photographers and even tourists to the city. It is from this trend that the critical term ruin porn emerged, pointing to an idea of exploitation and harm that is involved in photographing urban ruins where the site is still a functioning city with a history and residents that have been and will continue to be affected by the subject matter long after the photographer moves on. In the same way that viewing pornography often desensitizes viewers to violence, there is a comparable disconnect where the viewer of ruin porn doesn't have to consider the circumstances under which the content was created. John Patrick Leary gives a detailed account of this trend, stating that, quote, "So much ruined photography and ruined film aestheticizes poverty without inquiring of its origins, dramatizes spaces but never seeks out the people that inhabit and transform them, and romanticizes isolated acts of resistance without acknowledging the massive political and social forces aligned against the real transformation and not just stubborn survival of the city," end quote. This reflects one of my central criticisms. The Ruins of Detroit aestheticizes Detroit's ruin, presents it as a material that is visually provocative. This type of work ends up fetishizing and even celebrating decay, which is, in Detroit's case especially, inextricably linked to poverty and racial inequality. This project seeks to challenge the notion that photos are inherently documentary. Rather, photos are constructed works of art that carry meaning as well as power. Susan Sontag utilizes the term photographic seeing, which has the ability to transform our perception of reality, acknowledging that a photo is not a truth. Throughout my experience studying the ruins of Detroit, it seemed that each time I combed through the photos, and especially when I looked at them with other people, different questions emerged of how the photos were created. Technical elements of photography, such as lighting, editing, focal points, exposure, and lines, are transformative decisions made and considered by photographers. There are also physical elements within the setting that can be manipulated to make an image. Objects can be positioned, repositioned, even placed. People can be vacated. The ways in which these photographers have manipulated their work remains unknown to the viewer, but this critical acknowledgement is crucial. Visual images carry meanings, and many scholars have theorized at what point and how exactly meaning is created and transmitted. Sontag holds the photographer in a position of power, with photography functioning as an intervention that is determined by the ideology and subject position of the photographer, whether they intend the influence or not. Sontag theorizes an aggressive tendency towards ownership, which is present in the act of taking a photo of something. Photographs have the ability to influence cultural standards of beauty. A photographer can create an image that is aesthetically pleasing in ways that may or may not correspond to reality. There is power then in the hands of the photographer in deciding what they choose to photograph and how. How is it that the viewer can find images of Detroit's ruin beautiful when the ruin is in many ways so closely tied to poverty and suffering? Would a viewer find Detroit ruins beautiful if they saw them every day? What if the photo showed homeless people living inside? Whether intentional or not, the fetishization of these ruins relies on the human realities being out of the picture. In my project, I also describe the ruins of Detroit as a form of aesthetic appropriation. To understand the concept of appropriation, I draw upon Bell Hooks, who writes, quote, "Currently, the commodification of difference promotes paradigms of consumption wherein whatever difference the other inhabits is eradicated via exchange by a form of consumer cannibalism that not only displaces the other, but denies the significance of that other's history through a process of decontextualization," end quote. The ruins of Detroit are sites with significant histories and meanings attached and embedded within them. These histories and meanings may differ for people who had different relationships to and interactions within these spaces, but for many, these spaces are historically and currently sites of struggle. 700,000 people still live in the city of Detroit. They are overwhelmingly working class, poor, and African American. While there is some historical context given to the state of ruin in the book, there is heavy focus on architecture and very little mention of the people who remain in the city. To perceive these images as beautiful or even as shocking requires a certain level of detachment from one's own typical surroundings. These photographers had no prior connection to the city of Detroit. They are French photographers whose interest stemmed simply from an artistic focus on documenting ruin as a temporary state. Now, after having spent time over a period of 5 years photographing these spaces, they profit from images of Detroit's difference. These photos, in the context of a coffee table book, also carry certain implications about its purpose. The book is printed in Germany to be bought and consumed by people all over the world who have disparate information about relationships with and perceptions of Detroit. In my project, I also draw upon Stuart Hall's concept of representation, and particularly his reading of Michel Foucault. Hall lays out many different approaches to the problem of representation, which connects meaning and language to culture. meaning is not inherent, but constructed through the practice of representation, a signifying practice. Meaning is not entirely dependent on the materiality of a sign, but also its symbolic function. If The Ruins of Detroit is functioning as a form of representation, the book and the photos are active in a process of constructing meaning about the city of Detroit, its history, and implicitly about its residents as well. Michel Foucault's discursive approach to the problem of representation defines discourse as a system of representation involving power, knowledge, and the subject. The Ruins of Detroit belongs to the larger discursive formation of ruins photography, or ruin porn. Explicating Foucault's understanding of discourse, Stuart Hall identifies different elements within the concept to study. One of these elements is the subject, as Hall writes that, quote, subjects which personify the discourse with the attributes we would expect these subjects to have given the way knowledge about the topic was constructed at the time, end quote. In The Ruins of Detroit, there's a lack of subjects appearing in the photographs. However, this lack of visible subjects does not necessarily mean that the reader is to imagine a lack of subjects in the city of Detroit itself. Rather, they may have their own discursively formed imagined subject who would occupy or navigate the spaces represented in the photographs. Another element Hall identifies is, quote, how this knowledge about the topic acquires authority, a sense of embodying the truth about it, constituting the truth of the matter at a historical moment. The Ruins of Detroit, or more broadly, ruin porn as a discursive formation, constructs a truth of this historical moment for the city of Detroit that is void of life. In the discursive approach to representation, Foucault uses the concept of power knowledge, which is embedded in discourse. For Foucault, the subject is produced within discourse and must always be subjected to discourse. The residents of Detroit are the human subjects implicated in this process. Their subjectivities being produced and really being erased within a discourse that highlights decay and abandonment of a city, but neglects remaining life or humanity within the space.